All right, guys, our last chapter for today, we're going to read chapter 3. May 21st through early July 1804. The journey begins. Seamen rushed from side to side of the keelboat, his wet tail slapping the supplies, lashed tightly against the vessel's cabin. The river was bustling with activity. Men splashed into the water and climbed into the canoe like pirogues. Pirogues. Don't know why I'm having trouble remembering that word. Their faces glistened in the warm, steady rain as they jumped into the boats. They grabbed their oars and steadied their vessels. As the explorers readied the boats, a small crowd gathered to watch Lewis and Clark's expedition take off. At last, the boats were ready. The townsfolk gave 3 cheers. The men on board answered with shouts and cheers. Seaman squeezed past George Shannon, heaved himself up, and balanced his front paws on the boat's rail. He barked and wagged his slopping tail. "Hey!" complained Shannon as the dog's tail swatted his face, leaving a smear of mud across his cheek. He wiped his face and gave the dog a good-natured shove. Seaman turned and licked Shannon's nose. "When will you return?" hollered a voice from the shore. "In 2 years' time," shouted Shannon, standing up and waving a goodbye, "after we've tasted the brine of the Pacific Ocean." It was late afternoon, May 21st, 1804, when the boats pulled into the Missouri River. The expedition was leaving behind the civilization they knew. From now on, these 50 men would be traveling through wilderness. Their map would be the Missouri River. The only people they expected to see were Indians and a few trappers. Seaman settled down and watched George Shannon dig a long pole into the river's bottom. As Shannon pushed against his pole, he walked toward the back of the keelboat, forcing the boat to move forward against the current. 10 or 12 men pulled at a time, half of each side of the boat. When they reached the back of the keelboat, they pulled out the poles and walked to the bow of the boat to begin again. On the first afternoon, they traveled just over 3 miles. Clouds were gathering as they made camp on the island. It rained hard all night. At 6 o'clock in the morning on May 22nd, they proceeded on. Traveling against the Missouri's current with a heavily loaded keyboat was difficult. If there was any wind, the men ran the boat's sail. If not, they had to use muscle power to row the pole If not, they had to use the muscle power to row or pull the boat upstream. Sometimes they sailed and pulled at the same time. If sailing, rolling, and poling didn't move the boat upriver, a team of men jumped out and tugged along the shore, pulling the boat at the end of stout lines. These men sometimes had to walk through water up to their hips or their waists, and they often slipped on muddy bottoms. Seamen splashed through the shallows or swam next to the men while they waded. He loved to be wet, and the sight of him encouraged the tired men. Since the current was strongest in the center of the river, the men tried to keep the keelboat close to either shore, but the Missouri's muddy banks often caved into the water, endangering the men and boats. Rocky sandbars or dreaded trees hidden under the surface of the river would snag the boat. The Corps of Discovery was not the first group to encounter these problems. Traders using the Missouri waterway had complained about how difficult it was to travel and had given the nickname the Big Muddy. Clark usually rowed on the keelboat. He loved to be around people, and he was a better waterman than Lewis. As the group traveled, Clark kept track of their distance and recorded it in their field notes. He also sketched maps of their routes to estimate the distance the boats traveled. Clark used the dead reckoning. He picked out a landmark ahead of the boat, sometimes a sandbar, sometimes a large tree jutting out over the river. Then he estimated how long it took the boat to reach the spot and how fast the boat was traveling. Clark compared how long it had taken their boat to travel same distance at that speed on the Ohio or Mississippi rivers, waterways that had already been mapped and measured. Each day, Clark measured how far the expedition traveled. He hoped to measure the whole journey to the Pacific Ocean. When the Corps of Discovery returned to the United States, Clark planned to give his notes to the map makers so they could draw a map of North America. Lewis preferred walking to boating. He enjoyed being alone to observe his surroundings. In the mornings, after the men broke camp, Lewis would whistle for Seaman. Together they would set off, picking their way through the lush plant growth beside the river. Lewis might cover 30 miles in a day, his long legs striding briskly through the woods. In the late afternoon, he made his way back to the river to rejoin the boats. On his walk, Lewis stopped often to examine a flower or pull a leaf from a tree. He collected some plants, sketched others. Sometimes he leaned against a tree to watch an animal or listen to a songbird. Many of these plants and animals were unknown to the American scientists, and it was part of Lewis's job to find out what kind of life could be out west of the Mississippi River. Here's the image on the page. Seaman did not always lay close to Lewis. He bounded off through the woods in pursuit of a squirrel or a rabbit. Usually he found his way back to camp by evening, but sometimes he spent the night hunting and rejoining the men as they were pushing off their boats the next morning. Of all the difficulties the explorers encountered while traveling on the Big Muddy, the biggest problems were caused by the smallest of pests. Ticks latched onto their skins, and gnats swarmed around their ears and eyes. Clouds of mosquitoes and buzzed around them, especially in camp. The men stood in the smoke of the fires to keep off the insects. They smeared thick, smelly bear grease on their necks and faces and hands to protect their skin. Seaman was constantly rubbing the flies and insect off his eyes, too, and off his nose and his paws. Although his fur was too thick for the gnats and mosquitoes to penetrate, the ticks burrowed through his coat to reach their warm skin. These small, flat-bodied creatures buried their heads inside his hide and feasted on his blood. They swelled up to the size of acorns, and he couldn't reach them with his claws or his teeth. Sitting by the campfire in the evenings, George Shannon ran his hands through Seaman's fur, searching for ticks. "Hold still, Seaman," he said. 14 ticks I've picked off of you, and I've only gotten as far as your chest. You're a regular pasture for these varmints. Varmints? Let's see. Nope, the word's not clicking. Whoop. Oh no. Sorry, y'all. Let's just give it a second. I want to try and remember how to... Nope. How to get it bigger. It won't let me zoom in anymore. Goodness, I'm so sorry, y'all. I'm just going to have to sit closer for this time. Let me try one more thing. Okay. Well, I won't be able to zoom in like I was reading, so I'm going to have to sit closer. Sorry about that, y'all. Seaman rolled onto his side and stretched out his long legs. When Shannon talked to him, his tail thumped against the ground. Shannon picked off the ticks one by one and flattened them into the fire. The blood-swollen ticks popped as the flames consumed them. In a little over a month, the explorers traveled about 400 miles up the Missouri River. On the morning of July 4th, the men celebrated America's 28th birthday by firing their swivel gun, a cannon mounted on the keelboat. Seaman barked and the men cheered. That afternoon, they pulled up the boats at the mouth of the creek and named it Independence Creek in honor of the holiday. At sunset, they fired the cannon once again. The next morning, the keelboat got caught on a tangle of driftwood. The men soon spotted the source of the driftwood, a beaver lodge. Clark ordered the boats to pull in for the evening camp. If the hunters could shoot the beavers, there would be a feast around the evening campfires. Beaver meat is tasty, and the men considered beaver tail a delicacy. Clark looked around, but there were no beavers in sight. The animals had taken shelter in their underwater lodge, and they heard the noise of the approaching boats. Jumping out of the boat, Clark waded to the bank and whistled for Seaman. The dog bounded over, his eyes eagerly searching Clark's face. Pointing at the heap of wood jutting out of the water, Clark rested his other hand on Seaman's back. "It's a beaver lodge, Seaman. Get 'em!" He nudged Seaman, then grabbed his gun. Seaman leaped into the river, and he swam to the edge of the beaver lodge and dived beneath the water. A few of the men picked up their guns and joined Clark on the bank. They kept their eyes on the spot that Seaman had gone under. Soon the dog surfaced and dived again, driving a beaver to the surface. One of the men fired, and the beaver vanished, leaving a trail of red in the water. Seaman lunged toward it in an instant. He had the beaver in his mouth, and he was swimming towards the shore. He hopped out of the water and ran to Clark, water pouring off his coat. He sat in front of Clark, beaver in mouth and tail wagging. Clark grinned as he took the beaver, and he said, "Good job, Seaman. Get another one." Seaman sprang to his feet and leaped back into the river to flush out another beaver. The men whooped with joy. The thought over roasting beaver meat made their mouths water. Although game was plentiful and the men ate heartily each evening, their appetites were always sharp. The expedition had brought along a few horses, and several men rode out to camp every morning to hunt. At nightfall, the hunters rejoined the boat crews at the river, bringing fresh game and add to their evening meal. On the days Lewis rode at the keelboat, Seaman sometimes ran alongside the mounted hunters. He retrieved game and chased wounded animals. Seaman would carry birds and rabbits in his mouth. He dragged the larger animals like deer back to the hunters. John Colter loved hunting duty. He was at home in the woods, a skilled hunter and a tracker. Although he was reserved about the men, Colter had a way with horses and other animals. He always whistled for Seaman to join him when he hunted. As soon as he spotted the dog returning a fat turkey or a duck in his mouth, Colter would dismount. "Come on, Seaman, there's a fine fellow," he called, his hazel eyes sparkling. Seaman ran to Colter and sat, the game in his mouth. "Look at that fine work," Colter would exclaim. "Why, our supper is hardly bruised. You make a cook's job too easy, Seaman." Then Colter would open his knapsack, pull out some jerky, and reward Seaman with a tasty chunk of dried meat. Each day, from early morning until nightfall, the explorers worked hard, but there were few complaints. The warm, sunny countryside was full of deer, wild grapes, strawberries grew at the edge of the clearings, and purple raspberries were ripening along the river banks. The explorers ate enormous helpings at supper, as much as 9 pounds of meat apiece, and they slept there each night. This was a new world to explore, and in the summer of 1804, it was a beautiful place. And I'll see you guys tomorrow for Chapter 4.